The laughter was the part that stayed with me longest afterward. Not the argument. Not the document. Not even the moment everything changed in that county clerk's office on a gray Tuesday morning in February, when the woman behind the desk slid a single piece of paper across the counter, and my nephew Trevor's face went completely still. The laughter. Because Trevor had laughed first. Loud and dismissive and completely certain. The laugh of a 28-year-old man who has never once considered that a 26-year-old woman might know something he doesn't. He had laughed in my grandmother's kitchen 3 days after her funeral while I stood at the counter holding a copy of a document I had driven 4 hours to retrieve from a filing cabinet in my grandmother's spare bedroom, because she had called me 8 months earlier and told me exactly where it was and exactly why I would need it. He laughed. And I had looked at him across my grandmother's kitchen and waited, because I already knew what the county records said, and Trevor did not. My grandmother's name was Ruth Eleanor Price, and she was 79 years old when she died of a stroke in the farmhouse she had lived in for 51 years in central Kentucky. The farm was called Price Hollow. Not officially. Not on any county map or tax document. Just in the family. The way places accumulate names when enough people have lived and worked and loved and buried each other on the same piece of ground for long enough. 214 acres of rolling Kentucky farmland that my great-grandfather purchased in 1951 and that had stayed in the family through 3 generations by a combination of stubbornness, hard work, and the particular refusal of certain women to let beautiful things disappear. My grandmother was the last of those women. She had managed Price Hollow alone for 19 years after my grandfather Earl died of a heart attack in the Southfield at 61 years old. Not managed it symbolically. Actually managed it. The cattle, the hay operation, the equipment maintenance, the accounts, the relationships with neighboring farmers, the negotiations with the co-op, all of it. Ruth Price was 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed maybe 130 pounds, and she had run a 200-acre farm alone into her late 70s with the particular combination of competence and stubbornness that only certain women from certain generations possess. She was also the most perceptive person I have ever known. My name is Joanna Price. I am 26 years old. My mother was Ruth's youngest daughter. The third of 3 children, the one who moved to Cincinnati when she married my father and raised me in a suburb with good schools and a long driveway and very little connection to the Kentucky farmland where she grew up. But I came back every summer. From the time I was 7 until I left for college, I spent every June and July at Price Hollow. Not as a visitor, as a worker. My grandmother did not believe in guests. She believed in participants. By the time I was 12, I could drive the smaller tractor. By 15, I could read a soil report. By 17, I understood the farm's finances better than most adults understand their own household budgets, because Ruth sat me down at the kitchen table every summer and showed me exactly where every dollar came from and exactly where it went. She said she was teaching me because I was curious. I think she was teaching me because she already knew something I didn't. Trevor Price was my Uncle Dale's son. Dale was Ruth's oldest child. The son she had raised to eventually take over Price Hollow, the one who had grown up working the farm, the one who had always understood himself to be the natural heir to everything Ruth and Earl had built. Dale had moved back to the county after college. He lived 12 miles from the farm. He helped with equipment decisions and large purchases. And the particular category of farm business that required a man's presence at certain auctions and certain meetings, though Ruth had never once needed his help with the actual running of the place. Trevor was Dale's only child. 28 years old, broad-shouldered, comfortable in the way men are comfortable when they have grown up being told that something valuable will eventually be theirs. He worked at an equipment dealership in the county seat and drove a truck with the farm's name on the back window decal, even though he had not lived on the property since he was 19. He visited his grandmother on holiday. He called her occasionally. He was not unkind to her. He simply was not present for her in any of the ways that required inconvenience. I want to be fair about Trevor because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and the truth is more complicated than that. Trevor was not malicious. He was simply someone who had been raised to expect something and had never been asked to examine whether that expectation was warranted. That is a different kind of problem than cruelty. But it is still a problem. Ruth called me in April of the year before she died. I was living in Lexington at the time, working as a junior agricultural loan officer at a regional bank. A job I had taken specifically because it kept me connected to the kind of land and farming work that had shaped me, even if it kept me behind a desk more than I would have preferred. My grandmother called on a Wednesday evening while I was making dinner. She did not call often. Ruth Price communicated through action more than words and had always been slightly suspicious of the phone as a medium for important conversation. When she called, it meant something. "Joanna," she said, "I need you to come down this weekend if you can manage it." I drove down on Friday evening. We sat at the kitchen table Saturday morning with coffee and the particular quiet of a farmhouse early morning. Birds outside, cattle moving somewhere in the distant fields, the house itself breathing slowly around us. Ruth slid a folder across the table. "I want to show you something," she said. Inside the folder were documents, legal documents. I recognized the format immediately from my work. Deed transfers, trust agreements, property records. I read them carefully while my grandmother drank her coffee and watched me with the patient expression of someone who has already made all her decisions and is simply waiting for confirmation that the right person is receiving the information. When I finished reading, I looked up at her. "Grandma," I said carefully, "does Uncle Dale know about this?" Ruth set her coffee cup down. "Dale knows what I want him to know," she said. That sentence carried her entire philosophy inside it. She explained the structure to me methodically. 18 months earlier, Ruth had worked with an estate attorney in Bowling Green named Howard Pratt to restructure the farm's ownership documents. The changes were legal, properly recorded, and had been filed with the county clerk's office without announcement. The farm had been divided, not equally, not arbitrarily, according to a logic that was entirely Ruth's own and entirely consistent with the way she had thought about the land her entire adult life. 60% of Price Hollow remained in a family trust with Dale listed as primary trustee. The south fields, the main equipment barn, and the cattle operation infrastructure. The portion of the farm Dale had always been most involved with. The portion that reflected his actual relationship with the land. 40%. The north fields. The original homestead acreage where the farmhouse sat. The woodlands along the creek. Had been transferred into a separate trust with my name on it. My name. Joanna Price. 25 years old at the time. Granddaughter, not daughter. The child of the youngest sibling. By conventional family logic, not the obvious heir to anything. I stared at my grandmother. "Why?" I asked. Ruth looked out the kitchen window toward the north fields. The morning light was coming across them the way it came across them in early spring. Low and golden and full of the particular promise that farmland carries before the work season begins. "Because you know what this land is," she said simply. "And you'll keep it what it is." I sat with that for a long moment. "Trevor thinks he's inheriting the whole farm," I said. "Trevor thinks many things," Ruth said pleasantly. "Uncle Dale will receive exactly what I've outlined." She turned back toward me. "Which is substantial, Joanna. I am not punishing Dale. I am being accurate about what each person has earned." I looked back down at the documents. "There's one more thing," Ruth said. She reached into the folder and produced a second envelope, sealed. My name is on the front in her handwriting. "This is for after. Only open it if things become complicated." I took the envelope. "Will they?" I asked. "Become complicated?" Ruth almost smiled. "Trevor laughs at things he doesn't understand," she said. "It has always been his first response." She said it without bitterness, simply as observation. "The way you state facts about the weather. Keep the documents somewhere safe," she said. "And keep a copy with Howard Pratt. He has instructions." I drove back to Lexington Sunday evening with the folder on my passenger seat and my grandmother's sealed envelope in my bag and the particular weight of someone who has been trusted with something important and is still working out what that means. Ruth died 8 months later. November. Early morning. The farm's caretaker, an older man named Gene, who had worked for my grandmother for 12 years, found her in the kitchen when he came in to start the morning chores. She had come downstairs early, the way she always did, and simply didn't make it to the coffee pot. The doctor said she likely felt nothing. I believed him because Ruth Price had always been efficient in everything she did, and I could not imagine her approaching even death any other way. I drove down that same day. My mother and her two siblings, Dale and my Aunt Patricia, converged on the farm within hours. The house filled with the particular, overwhelming energy of a family gathering under grief. People cooking things nobody would eat, phones ringing constantly, old photographs appearing on tables. The strange suspended quality of a place that has just lost the person who held it together. Trevor arrived the next morning. He walked through the farmhouse with the proprietary ease of someone taking inventory of something he already considers his own. Not cruelly, just comfortably. The comfort of assumed ownership. He clapped his hand on my shoulder in the kitchen. "You holding up okay, Joe?" "I'm okay," I said. "Good." He looked around the kitchen. "Going to be a lot to sort out, but we'll get through it." We, including himself in the sorting, as though his involvement were already established. I said nothing. The funeral was on Thursday. The whole county came, the way whole counties come when someone has lived in one place long enough and well enough to become part of the landscape. Ruth's church was full. People stood along the walls, farmers in their good boots. Neighbors who had known her for 40 years. The woman from the co-op who had negotiated with her every season and told me afterward that Ruth Price was the finest businesswoman she had ever dealt with, regardless of industry. I sat in the front row beside my mother, held her hand, and thought about the folder in my bag. 3 days after the funeral, Trevor made his move. I was in the kitchen making coffee when he came in with Dale and sat down at the table with the particular settled energy of men who have already had a conversation and arrived at conclusions. Dale was 61, heavier than he used to be, with his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. He loved the farm genuinely. He had simply loved it the way some people love things, from a comfortable distance on his own terms. "Joe," Trevor said, "we need to talk about next steps." I poured my coffee, sat down across from them. "We're thinking we'll keep the operation running through spring," Dale said, "and then evaluate options. There's been interest from the Harlan family in the next county. They've been expanding selling." He was talking about selling. Grandma never mentioned wanting to sell, I said carefully. Dale waved his hand. "Mom had a sentimental attachment. Understandable. But the practical reality is that running this operation requires." "I know what running this operation requires," I said. "I've been learning it since I was 12. Trevor smiled, not unkindly. Just with the particular patient condescension of someone explaining something obvious to someone they consider younger and less informed. "Joe, we appreciate that you spent summers here. But this is a significant agricultural asset. These decisions need to be made by the people who are actually responsible for it." "And who would that be?" I asked. "Dad inherits the farm," Trevor said simply. "That's how it works. Mom's estate goes to her children." I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. "Have you spoken with Howard Pratt?" I asked. Dale frowned. "Ruth's attorney?" "I called his office yesterday. He said there are some documents to review." "Some documents," I said. "Standard estate stuff. We have an appointment on Monday." I nodded slowly. "Trevor," I said, "what do you think Grandma left you specifically?" He leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who has never seriously questioned his own assumptions. "The farm passes to Dad. Eventually it comes to me," he shrugged. "That's how these things work in families like ours." "Families like ours." I looked at him across my grandmother's kitchen table. "Did Grandma ever tell you that?" I asked. "Specifically?" He smiled. "She didn't have to. It's understood." I took a sip of my coffee. "I see," I said. And I let the conversation end there because Howard Pratt had instructions, and Monday was 3 days away, and some information is better delivered in the presence of documentation. That was when Trevor laughed. Later that same afternoon, he was talking to a cousin in the living room, and the conversation turned to future plans for the property, and someone asked whether I had any stake in the farm, and Trevor said, with complete casual certainty, "Joe? No. She's a granddaughter. Dale inherits everything." And the cousin looked toward me where I was standing in the kitchen doorway. And Trevor followed the look and saw me and said, "Right, Joe? You understand how this works?" I said, "Actually, I own 40% of the north acreage." And Trevor laughed. Loud. Genuine. The laugh of someone who finds an idea so unlikely it registers as comedy rather than information. "Joe," he said, still smiling, "that's not how inheritance works." "It is when your grandmother files the paperwork 18 months before she dies," I said. He shook his head. Still smiling. Still certain. "We'll sort it all out Monday," he said. "Yes," I said. "We will." Howard Pratt's office was in a building on the main street of Bowling Green that had once been a hardware store and still had the original pressed tin ceiling. He was a man in his mid-60s with reading glasses and the unhurried precision of someone who had spent 40 years ensuring that the documents he prepared would withstand exactly the kind of scrutiny they were about to receive. He had arranged chairs in a semicircle in front of his desk. Dale sat in the center.
Trevor beside him, my Aunt Patricia on the other side, my mother next to her. I sat at the end with my folder on my lap. Howard opened his own folder without preamble. Ruth updated her estate documents 18 months ago, he said. The changes were substantial and were recorded with the county clerk at the time of filing. I want to walk through them carefully because I want everyone to have a complete understanding before we discuss next steps. Dale leaned forward. How substantial? Howard began explaining. He was methodical and clear and completely neutral in his tone. The way good attorneys are neutral when delivering information that will not land equally on everyone in the room. He explained the trust structure. He explained the division of the acreage. He explained the reasoning Ruth had documented in her letter of intent, which Howard read aloud in its entirety in my grandmother's plain, direct voice. I kept my eyes on Trevor while Howard read. His expression moved through several stages. Confusion first. The documents weren't matching the map he had built in his head. Then something sharper as the acreage percentages became clear. Then a long stillness as Howard read the specific language Ruth had used to explain why 40% of the north acreage had been designated separately. Ruth had written, in her own words, signed and notarized, that Joanna Price had demonstrated over 15 years of consistent engagement with the land, its finances, and its operation a depth of understanding and commitment that warranted formal recognition in the estate structure. That the north acreage specifically, the original homestead land, the woodland along the creek, the fields her own father had first broken, should remain with someone who would preserve its character rather than evaluate its market value. She had written, and Howard read this part carefully, that she loved her son Dale and trusted him with the operational portion of the farm he had always engaged with most. And she had written that she loved her granddaughter, Joanna, and trusted her with the portion of the farm that needed to be loved rather than managed. Howard finished reading. The office was completely quiet. Trevor looked at me. You knew about this, he said. Yes. How long? 8 months before she died. His jaw tightened. And you didn't say anything. She asked me not to. Dale was looking at the documents in Howard's hands with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Not anger exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of a man reassessing something he thought he understood. Dad gets 60%? Trevor said, working it through aloud. And Joe gets 40. Of the north acreage specifically. Howard clarified. The division is geographic as well as proportional. Trevor looked at his father. Can we contest it? Howard answered before Dale could. The documents are properly executed, recorded, and accompanied by a notarized letter of intent establishing clear reasoning. Contesting would require demonstrating that Ruth Price lacked capacity or was subject to undue influence at the time of filing. He paused. I can tell you that neither argument would be supportable. I worked with Ruth directly. She was entirely clear and entirely deliberate. Silence. Dale finally spoke. Why didn't she tell me? He asked. Not angrily. Genuinely. Howard looked toward me. I opened my folder and removed the sealed envelope. She left this, I said. For after, I slid it across Howard's desk toward Dale. Not toward Trevor. Toward Dale. Because whatever Ruth had to say, she had meant it for her son. Dale opened the envelope slowly. Read the letter inside without speaking. His expression changed gradually as he read. Something in it softening, then tightening, then settling into a quieter place. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully. She said. Dale began, then stopped. He cleared his throat. She said she hoped I would understand that she wasn't taking anything from me. She was giving Joanna what Joanna had already earned. The room held that sentence for a long moment. Trevor looked at his hands. My mother pressed her fingers to her mouth. Aunt Patricia stared at the pressed tin ceiling. I looked at the folder in my lap and thought about my grandmother at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning in April, sliding documents across the worn wood surface with the patient certainty of a woman who had already thought everything through. We drove to the county clerk's office afterward. Not all of us. Just Trevor and me, because Trevor had asked to see the recorded documents himself, and I had said I would go with him because some things are better witnessed than described. The woman behind the desk, a pleasant woman in her 50s named Barbara, who clearly knew exactly why we were there based on Howard's earlier call, produced the filed records efficiently. The deed transfers. The trust documentation. Everything was properly stamped and dated 18 months earlier, exactly as Howard had said. Trevor stood at the counter, reading each page. He was quiet for a long time. Then he set the last page down and looked at me. You drove 4 hours to get those documents, he said. After the funeral. Yes. Because you already knew they existed. Yes. He was quiet again. Not angry now. Something more honest than anger. I laughed at you, he said. You did. In Grandma's kitchen. Yes. He looked back at the documents. At my grandmother's property, divided clearly and legally on paper in exactly the way she had intended. She really planned this, he said. 18 months out, I said. With Howard, properly recorded. She was very thorough. Trevor rubbed the back of his neck slowly. The gesture of a man working through something uncomfortable in real time. I assumed, he said finally. I know. I never asked her. He looked at me. What she actually wanted. For the farm. I just assumed. That was the most honest thing Trevor had said in 3 days. I looked at him carefully. At my cousin, my grandmother's grandson, someone who had grown up connected to Price Hollow in his own real way. Even if that way had been less consistent than mine. She didn't leave you anything, I said. Through your dad, you have access to 60% of a working farm. That's not. He stopped. I know it's not what you expected, I said, but it's what she decided. And she decided it carefully. He nodded slowly. We stood in the county clerk's office for another moment. Barbara is behind her desk, pretending to organize papers. The afternoon light coming through the windows at the particular angle it comes through windows in Kentucky in February. Low and pale and honest. What are you going to do with your portion? Trevor asked finally. Keep it, I said. Run it. He looked at me. You're moving back? I've been talking to the bank about transferring to the Bowling Green office, I said. I started those conversations 6 months ago. Trevor stared at me. She told you, didn't she? He said. She told you all of this was coming, and you started preparing. Yes, he shook his head slowly. Not with anger. With something closer to wonder. She knew you'd do that, he said. She did. And she knew I wouldn't. I didn't answer that directly. Because the answer was yes, and saying it plainly felt unkind even if it was accurate. Instead, I said she loved you, Trevor. This wasn't about punishing you. It feels like it, I know. I looked out the window toward the February street. But think about what she actually gave your dad. The cattle operation, the equipment, the south fields, the infrastructure. That's the working heart of the farm. Trevor was quiet. She gave him what he'd actually use, I said. And she gave me what I'd actually preserve. He thought about that for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she understood us better than we understood ourselves. That sentence landed with particular weight because it was the same thing Gary had said about our own mother in the story I had been living parallel to this one. Not identical. Every family is different, every grandmother is different, every piece of land holds its own particular meaning. But underneath it is the same truth. The women who are paying attention always see more clearly than the people who assume they are not. I moved to Bowling Green in March. The bank transfer came through faster than I expected. The regional manager had been trying to expand their agricultural lending presence in the county for 2 years. And a loan officer with my background and my grandmother's land in her name was exactly the kind of hire that made sense in multiple directions simultaneously. Gene stayed on as caretaker through the transition. He had known my grandmother for 12 years, and he knew the North Acreage the way you know land when you have worked it through every season for long enough. He showed me things in those first months. Drainage patterns, the particular way the creek field held moisture, the old fence lines that needed replacing before summer. Practical knowledge. The kind that lives in the ground rather than in documents. Dale and I had a long conversation in February, just the two of us, at the kitchen table where his mother had sat for 51 years. He had read her letter several times by then. She said something I keep thinking about, he told me. He looked down at his coffee. She said she wasn't dividing the farm. She was continuing it. He paused. 2 different people, 2 different portions, both in the family, both staying. I nodded. I think she was afraid, he said. That if she left it all to me, I'd sell it. I said nothing. He looked up at me. She was right to be afraid. That honesty cost him something. I could see it. Dale Price was not a man who found self-examination comfortable, but he was doing it anyway, which mattered. I'm not going to fight the documents, he said. I want you to know that. Thank you. And I want. He stopped. I want to make this work. The 2 of us. The farm. Together. I looked at my uncle across the kitchen table. So do I said. We shook hands on it. not a legal agreement. Just two people deciding to honor what Ruth had built rather than argue about it. That felt like the right beginning. Trevor came by the farm in April. He showed up on a Saturday morning without calling, which was actually progress, because it meant he was thinking of it as a place he could come to rather than a place he had lost access to. He found me in the north field checking the fence line along the creek. He walked the fence with me for a while without saying much. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." Trevor. "No," he said. "I laughed at you. In Grandma's kitchen. When you said you owned 40%. He shook his head. "That was. I was dismissive of you in a way that wasn't right." I stopped walking. "You didn't know," I said. "I didn't know because I never asked," he said. "I never had a real conversation with Grandma about the farm, about what she wanted, about what she'd built." He looked out across the north fields. The April light was on them now, warmer, fuller than February, the fields beginning to green up around the creek margins. "I just assumed. Assumption is comfortable," I said, "until it isn't." We stood together looking at the land for a moment. "She was something else," Trevor said quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "She was." He turned toward me. "You're going to do right by it." It wasn't a question. "I'm going to try," I said. He nodded. Then he did something that surprised me. He reached out and picked up a section of the fence wire I had been checking and held it taut while I worked the staple back into the post. Practical, helpful. No performance. Just a man showing up for the ordinary part of a job that needed doing. My grandmother would have appreciated that. I am 26 years old, and I live in the farmhouse my great-grandfather built in 1951 on land that has been in my family for 3 generations. What needs doing? What is coming through the soil as the season advances? Some mornings the creek is loud with runoff after rain. Some mornings it is completely still. Some mornings deer come out of the woodlands at the edge of the property and stand in the field for a few minutes before deciding I am too close and disappearing back into the trees. Ruth Price watched those same deer from these same fields for 51 years. I think about that sometimes. I think about the Saturday morning in April when she slid those documents across the kitchen table and waited while I read them. About the particular patience of a woman who had already made all her decisions and was simply confirming that the right person had received the right information. She had seen something in me that I was still learning to see in myself. That is what grandmothers do, I think, when they are paying attention. They see the shape of who you are becoming before you have finished becoming it. And the wise ones. The ones like Ruth Eleanor Price who have spent decades watching things grow from seed to harvest and back again. They plan accordingly. She gave me the land that needed to be loved. And she trusted that I would love it. She was right. Trevor was wrong to laugh. But he understood why eventually, which matters more than being right the first time. Understanding is something you can arrive at late and still have it count. If you have ever been the person in your family who showed up for the ordinary parts, the one who came in summer and stayed through the hard seasons and learned the things nobody else bothered to learn, I hope you know that the people who matter most always notice. They notice the presence. They notice the attention. They notice who asks questions and who assumes answers. And sometimes, in the most deliberate and loving way possible, they write it all down in documents properly recorded with the county clerk 18 months before they die, so that when someone laughs in the kitchen thinking they already know the answer, the records are already there waiting. Quiet women plan ahead. They always have. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of land or family or someone who saw you more clearly than you saw yourself, please share it with someone who might need the reminder.